I didn't know I had complex post-traumatic stress disorder until I was in my 30s. In fact, I didn't even realize that a lot of the things I was experiencing that were byproducts of trauma were actually trauma responses. I did know what PTSD was, but I didn't realize there was something else called complex post-traumatic stress disorder that was affecting me. If you want to find out more about complex post-traumatic stress disorder, stick around. Hello, my name is Elfreda of Metta-morphics. This video series is to help people who feel like there's something wrong with them, who think that because of the way they respond to their life, the people in their life, their experiences, that they're reacting in a way that is weird or different or not like everybody else. And I want people to realize that however you're reacting, however you're responding to what's happening in your life, under the circumstances, it's totally freaking normal. Because in actual fact, there isn't really a normal. There is just how you respond. And the most important thing is that you're doing okay and that you're figuring out how to do things the best way for you. This video is about complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And complex post-traumatic stress disorder is something that occurs when somebody has an experience of what they call complex trauma. And complex trauma is ongoing trauma that occurs over an extended period of time. It can be living in a home where there is domestic abuse or violence. It can be dealing with addictions or alcoholism. It can be being in a war zone or somewhere else where there is ongoing stress, even being in a workplace where there's bullying or continual bullying. And so complex trauma has a different response or reaction in people to, say, an individual traumatic experience. And so the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Health, talks about PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I had post-traumatic stress disorder many years ago after a car accident, and I was able to recognize it because I understood what it was fairly quickly. I had issues with insomnia where I had continual dreams about the accident or having car accidents. When I was in my car, I would have flashbacks of the moment that I had turned my car over when I had the previous accident. I used to pull in and get out and, as an anxiety response, check all the tires in my car because my accident had been caused by a slow puncture. I had panic attacks sometimes at night where I would get really overwhelmed by the fear that I had, and I felt embarrassed and ashamed that I was feeling this. Now, thankfully for me, a lot of that changed when I actually changed to a different type of car, because I changed from the model of car that I had when I had a crash to a much bigger car, and in doing that I felt a lot safer, and as I felt safer, my symptoms of PTSD went away. Now, I knew what PTSD was and I knew that it existed as a thing, but I didn't know that there was a thing called complex PTSD or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and I didn't find that out until much later in life. Now, complex post-traumatic stress disorder is a little different to PTSD, and the difference is that because the stress is ongoing, it actually changes you in a long-term kind of way. And so when we're faced with stress, we have a stress response and we have our fight, flight, or freeze. Our fight is where we think, I can attack this or I can handle this. Our flight is where we feel we have to run away. And our freeze is where we shut down as a defense mechanism to protect ourselves. But somebody who experiences complex trauma and complex post-traumatic trauma flits between these processes all the time, plus an additional fourth one called fawn. And so that means when we're in the fight mode all the time, we may be continually argumentative or controlling or expecting things to be perfect from other people or acting as if we're always right or we're above reproach. If we're in our flight, then we're busy, always doing stuff, can't sit still, always on the go, fussing, micromanaging everything. When we're in our freeze, this is where we go into a shutdown, where we're completely overwhelmed. And this can often appear like depression, where it's the couch potato, no energy, lacking motivation, afraid of trying anything new in case you'll fail, but completely overwhelmed and exhausted in many ways. Now, fawn is not one of those physiological responses. Fawn is a behavioral response. And fawn is often what people do on an ongoing basis when they're dealing with complex trauma, which means they go into a people-pleasing mode. So they try to do everything to keep everybody happy so that there aren't these peaks in the stress, and it also keeps them away from the other responses. Now, those responses are what happens to us when we move out of what they call a window of tolerance. And so we all have a window of tolerance when it comes to our stress, where we can handle what's going on. And in complex trauma, the window of tolerance is often maintained by people pleasing, which isn't a good thing. It isn't a healthy thing, certainly not for the individual who's doing it. But when we move out of that window and we move into one side, we go into our fight or flight, which is our hyperarousal state. If we move out to the other side, we go into a hypoarousal state, and that is our freeze. Now, I know that over the years, I probably would have been cycling through this all the time. I was a chronic people pleaser all the time. I regularly went into fight in certain situations in life where I became argumentative. I would keep busy all the time, anxious and worried and trying to keep on top of things in my flight mode. But I can remember very clearly in my teens, my parents separated for a period of time while my father went away to work, and I went into freeze. And I couldn't sleep enough. I was lethargic, I was lazy, I was really struggling. My mother brought me at the time to the doctor. They tested me for everything and said, we can't figure out what's wrong with her. And it wasn't because there was something physically wrong with me. It was that my nervous system was reacting to the fact that the stressor, which was my father, unfortunately, because of his alcoholism and because of my home life, that when that was removed, I went into a freeze mode because I was completely overwhelmed by maintaining things all the time. And so in complex post-traumatic stress disorder, people often have hypervigilance. And that means they're always on guard. They have an increased startle response. So that's where you jump, at a noise, the doorbell rings, you hear a bang and you jump. People who aren't in hypervigilance often are quite calm in that, unless they're dissociated, and then they might just be numb and they don't respond. And that is a freeze response. But in general, the hypervigilance means you're always looking for problems. You're always looking for what could go wrong. You're constantly on guard, expecting the worst all of the time. And it triggers immense feelings of anxiety and worry and stress. Now, the other thing that people experience when they experience complex post-traumatic stress disorder is that they experience emotional flashbacks. And these often occur long after the trauma has gone away. And in my case, my trauma is many years in the past now. But I would still have these emotional flashbacks. And that's where you'll be in a situation and something will trigger you. So it will feel to your unconscious and to your physiology in your body like something that happened before. And suddenly you'll start to react in that way, which may be into a fight mode, it may be flight, it may be freeze. So you might shut down to protect yourself. It may be that you go into really big on people pleasing. Or it may be that you just become overwhelmed by emotions, become very, very upset, distressed, not understanding why you're feeling, but just knowing I don't want this or I don't like this. And reactions from the outside for other people may look like you're behaving badly or that you're overreacting. But in actual fact, it's not a conscious response, it's that we're getting triggered. The other thing that we experience in complex post-traumatic stress disorder is toxic shame. And so this is a constant feeling like you're not good enough, but also when little things happen, you feel this overwhelming sense of shame and embarrassment. So I can remember situations in my past where I might be in a conversation, for example, and I say something and then people don't necessarily react or respond, which often happens. And I will immediately take that personally. I would go away and I would think I did something wrong. There's something wrong with me. They don't like me. And then I would feel like I didn't want to go back to that situation again. And it would trigger avoidant behavior in me where I would avoid those people or those situations because I felt so ashamed. Now, thankfully for me, my trauma is no longer here. So I haven't been faced with trauma since my 30s, because although I had trauma in my childhood, I did have two very difficult relationships in adulthood. One that was physically abusive towards the end, and one that was very emotionally abusive and that had addiction in it. And so in those situations, I didn't get away from the trauma. But when I did, that gave me an opportunity to actually step out a bit and to look and see. And that's when I learned about complex post-traumatic stress disorder. If you're dealing with ongoing trauma, you do need support and you do need help. And you do need to reach out to people that will help you to handle what you're feeling. But do remember that if you're experiencing complex post-traumatic stress disorder, it's because it's necessary. It's protective. It's keeping you alive. And I recognize that now, that if I didn't have hypervigilance, if I didn't experience my experiences of toxic shame, however unpleasant, or the emotional flashbacks, I may have got myself into situations that I couldn't have got out of. So my physiology, my nervous system, my central nervous system was actually protecting me in those contexts. Now it's not so useful. So one of the things, and if you watch some of my other videos, you'll know I've mentioned this, one of the things I do is I meditate, and the meditation gives me periods where I can be still and I can be calm. And for me, that's been teaching my nervous system that it's okay for me to come away from flight mode. It's okay to move away from those other states into a state of calm. It's also increasing my window of tolerance. So my stress response is much, much bigger and much stronger, in the sense of I have a lot more time and energy and space before I become stressed, before I go into fight, flight, or freeze. So it's triggering an ongoing state of calm. It also makes me feel safer to connect with people. And they talk about the window of tolerance being the social engagement part of us, where we can connect with people, feel safe and feel comfortable. Because unfortunately, often with trauma, and particularly complex trauma, it's related to another person or other people in your life. And so for me, my meditation has really supported me. The other thing is accepting myself, accepting my toxic shame, accepting my emotional flashbacks, being able to state that that's what it is. I know in my home life, it's a very safe space for me. And so if I have an emotional flashback, I'm able to say that, oh, I'm experiencing an emotional flashback, or I'm recognizing I'm being triggered, and give myself time and space to experience that in a way that's safe and that's comfortable. And in relation to the toxic shame, being able to say it's okay that I've made mistakes. I don't have to meet some perfect standard, and getting comfortable with that, and recognizing, because I've made a mistake in one situation, if I have, that it doesn't mean I'm going to be making it in every situation. And that sometimes I haven't made a mistake. It's just that my feelings have been triggered, and to be able to recognize that. Now, I work a lot with people who are on the scale of post-traumatic growth. So what's happening is they're moving away from their trauma and they're moving into a growth phase. And when I work with them coaching, we often recognize some of the symptoms of complex trauma, and I support them in working through those. It's important that you find somebody to work through those if it's something that you're experiencing, and if it's something that somebody you know is experiencing, then maybe have a conversation about that with them, to help them to understand that if they are reacting in ways and it's making them feel embarrassed or ashamed, or they're avoiding things, that you can say to them, it's probably a trauma response. And that we often, all of us in fact, probably have trauma responses without even having complex trauma, for the simple reason that an awful lot of people experience some level of trauma in their lifetime. In fact, I know research in Ireland only last year said 80% of people experience at least one type of trauma in their lifetime. So a trauma doesn't necessarily have to be the big thing that we associate with PTSD, but it is enough that makes us feel vulnerable, makes us feel threatened, or threatens what we call our assumptive or core beliefs. So how we think the world will work. If you want to find out more about what I do, then please get in touch with me. My website is below. If you subscribe to my channel, then hopefully you'll watch some of my other videos. And if you do have any questions, I would love to hear them. Or if you have any comments, I'm happy to respond to them. And remember, however you're reacting at this point in time, under the circumstances, it's totally frickin' normal.